Hello and welcome to NARUC'S Center for Partnership and Innovations webinar series. This is Dominic Libertor, Logistics and Finance Officer for CPI. Today's webinar will be covering a new electric paradigm in Puerto Rico, the role of distribution systems planning. Before we introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, what is NARUC? We are a nonprofit organization founded in 1889. Our members are the regulatory commissions in all 50 states and territories. Additionally, we have FERC and FCC commissioners who are also members, and we have associate members in over 20 countries. Our member agencies regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. Second, what is CPI? We are a grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members. We identify emerging challenges and provide expertise and strategies in our core topical areas. Please take a look at the topical areas in the chart. I also encourage you to check out our website for previous webinars, papers, and trainings at www.naruc.org/CPI. Also, a note on our website, we will have a new launch May 1, so be on the lookout for that for a streamlined website. For webinar logistics, this webinar is currently being recorded. It will be posted on our webpage. If you do have any questions, please use the chat box to send us your questions at any time in the webinar. Our panelists will be responding to audience questions during the moderated Q&A following the presentations. I will now hand it off to our moderator for the webinar, Carl Peckman. Carl is the director for the National Regulatory Research Institute. Before joining NRRI in April 2018, Carl served as an economist and an energy industry analyst for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and was assigned as a senior electricity advisor to the U.S. Department of Energy. His experience also includes 18 years as an economic supervisor to the staff of the New York Public Service Commission, in addition to serving as economic advisor to the California State Assembly. Carl, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I'm very gratified to be moderating this panel today. We're going to discuss what I consider to be a highly successful process. As I believe you all know, Puerto Rico has been hit by devastating storms and earthquakes that have resulted in an interest in rebuilding the electric system. At the core of that rebuilding is the adoption of renewables, in particular distributed energy resources. This process will create the roadmap to support the adoption of those renewables on the system at the distribution level. I want to mention several key members of this effort who are not on this call today. Commissioner Lillian Mateo has played an absolutely vital role in putting this together with Commissioner Ramos. Joe Palladino from the U.S. Department of Energy has done yeoman's work working with the stakeholders and the consultants and the commission, really moving this whole process along and making it as successful as it has been. And Jorge Camacho did a masterful job as the moderator. I'd like to now introduce of the various public sessions. I'd like to now introduce Commissioner Ferdinand Ramos. Commissioner Ramos obtained his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology in 2000, with concentrations in power distribution systems and telecommunication. Prior to his appointment to the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau, he was involved in various aspects of the electric industry, including design, construction, and maintenance of power distribution systems. He's a licensed professional engineer in the state of Florida and Puerto Rico. Commissioner Ramos, I look forward to your comments.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. pleasure to be here in collaboration with NRRI and NARUC and the DOE. So if you could, should I start my piece now? Could you
Yep, we're ready.
bring up my slides? Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank NARUC and their excellent staff for hosting this webinar. And I would also like to thank the DOE for their support, both directly and through the national labs, which have been in collaboration with Puerto Rico since the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in a lot of different areas. In the last couple of years, both organizations, the DOE and NARUC, have shown tremendous commitment with the Energy Bureau and Puerto Rico as a whole in an effort to aid in the implementation of the new energy public policy. I'm going to start by giving a little background and history of the electric regulation in Puerto Rico. Throughout history, the electric sector in Puerto Rico has undergone various transformations, from unregulated private-owned power utilities in the beginning of the century to public electric utility companies, to a public electric utility company conceived with the sole purpose of making electric power available throughout the island, no matter where it was needed. Around the mid-40s, only 12% of rural communities had electricity in Puerto Rico. Independent power producers entered the mix early in the 2000s, and finally, the Energy Bureau of the Puerto Rico Public Service Regulatory Board was created by a legislature through Act 57, 2014. Act 57 gave the Energy Bureau the duty and the authority to oversee the implementation of the energy public policy in Puerto Rico and to ensure a safe, efficient, and reliable electric system for the Puerto Rico ratepayers. Up until 2014, the electric energy industry in Puerto Rico was not regulated at all. For this reason, the long-term planning of the power grid had been entirely in the hands of PREPA personnel and the governor in office at the time. For many years, there was no visibility or possibility for public participation inside any electric planning initiative on the island. Next slide, please. Next slide. On May 22nd, 2015, this all changed when Puerto Rico Energy Commission, this is how the Energy Bureau was known at that time, approved and enacted the Regulation on Integrated Resource Plan for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. This new regulation ordered PREPA to file its first IRP into a full-blown adjudicative process. For the first time in history, the people of Puerto Rico would have visibility into long-term planning of their electric grid. It wasn't until September 23, 2016 that the final order on the first PREPA IRP was issued. Consequently, after various procedural matters, the first PREPA IRP became binding on March 13, 2017. That same year, on September 20th, just 6 months after IRP approval, Puerto Rico was struck by Hurricane Maria, causing the longest power outage in U.S. history. After Hurricane Maria, it was evident that the island's power grid needed to be reformed to a more decentralized and resilient model, and on March 14, 2018, just a year after the approval, the Energy Bureau initiated the first phase of the current IRP proceeding. The Energy Bureau gave PREPA until October 2018 to file a revised IRP, and PREPA ultimately filed on June 7, 2019. The procedural calendar of the current IRP proceeding concluded on April 20th, 2020, 10 days ago. And a final decision on the revised IRP is pending approval by the Energy Bureau. We're expecting that to be early June 2020. Next slide, please. PREPA is a vertically integrated government-owned utility with 1.5 million customers and an annual revenue of $3.4 billion, which makes it one of the biggest government-owned utilities in the United States. It's ranked 14th in the nation in terms of number of customers. The winding roads and mountainous terrain, coupled with the density of population, make for a grid that's quite complex. There's 1,150 distribution circuits, and this ranks PREPA 37th out of 1,961 utilities nationwide in quantity of distribution circuits. The vast majority of this distribution system operates at a voltage of 4.16 kV and has not been maintained or upgraded in many years. That being said, the effects of Hurricane Maria further demonstrated the fragility of the system and highlighted the necessity to modernize the grid. In recent years, the widespread development of DERs has shifted the paradigm of the typical electrical distribution system. It has spurred the need to plan and modernize distribution infrastructure like never before. Throughout the majority of the jurisdictions in the United States, there has been a need to rethink the way distribution systems are built and operated. In Puerto Rico, unlike the generation and transmission systems, whose long-term planning is achieved through an IRP, the distribution system in Puerto Rico is currently not required by regulation to go through a long-term comprehensive planning process. Next slide. This long-term comprehensive planning process is precisely what many jurisdictions are moving toward. It's worth mentioning that Puerto Rico is one of 16 jurisdictions which are part of the NARUC-NACIO Comprehensive Electricity Planning Task Force. This task force was created to provide a forum for the development of new approaches that could result in better alignment of long-term resource and distribution system planning. Taking full advantage of being on this task force, on May 20th, 2019, the Energy Bureau opened the docket that's there on the numbers there on the slide, through which we embarked on a mission to design a regulation with a set of guidelines on how the distribution system should be planned for and modernized on a prudent and logical way without unnecessarily affecting the ratepayers. The Energy Bureau initiated said proceeding by holding a series of 3 stakeholder workshops with the collaboration of the U.S. Department of Energy. I would personally like to take an opportunity to thank Mr. Joseph Palladino from the U.S. DOE for helping us tailor this initiative and for his continuing commitment with the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau. The primary intent of these workshops was to receive input and ensure public participation during the entire process of the conception of the intended regulation on distribution system planning. The initial workshops resulted in the organization of 3 working groups comprised of a wide range of stakeholders and PREPA personnel. They were designed to tackle different aspects of the planning initiatives. These working groups were identified as the Planning Coordination Working Group, Hosting Capacity and Data Acquisition Working Group, and the Resilience Working Group. Each one of these working groups met separately on 3 occasions and were tasked with giving the Energy Bureau specific recommendations on how, in their view, the Energy Bureau should pursue the distribution system planning initiative and be in a position to enact a formal regulation on distribution system planning. It is the intent of the Energy Bureau to eventually align the regulation on distribution system planning and the regulation on integrated resource planning. This alignment will result in an integrated system planning, which will most probably require various separate planning cycles to be achieved. That's it for my presentation. If there's any questions, I would gladly answer.
Carl, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
I apologize.
Yeah, there you go.
I double clicked instead of single clicking. And so I unmuted and then muted myself. So let me introduce Samir Sukar. Dr. Sukar is a member of ICF's Distributed Grid Strategy Group, focused on distribution system planning and grid modernization strategy and DER integration. He works with clients in evaluating the impact of distributed energy resources and has been involved in distribution system planning efforts across the country, including efforts in New York, Oregon, Michigan, California, Nevada, and Puerto Rico. Dr. Sukar has his undergraduate degree in physics from Oberlin College and his PhD in energy systems analysis from Princeton University. Dr. Sukar, I look forward to your comments.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Peckman. Appreciate it. Thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to offer a few thoughts about the stakeholder engagement process that Commissioner Ramos described, and talk a little bit about the work we did. What I want to cover today are some of the overall objectives. The Commissioner already kind of laid those out. I want to maybe take another step and talk about sort of the objectives of the process itself, and sort of how the structure of the process helped to kind of support those objectives, and then give a little bit of a flavor for the long-term sort of substantive vision of the effort. Commissioner spoke about kind of alignment of planning processes, so I want to sort of provide some details on sort of what that means and where we focused, and as a result of that, kind of some of the topics that we addressed in the working groups, and how we sequenced and mapped some of the coordination points, both sort of within the process and also with some of the other regulatory activity that the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau is undertaking currently. So with that, let me start with those objectives for the working groups. Thank you. And so, first and foremost, increasing education and awareness. And that's, both with respect to taking stock of all of the great work has been done in Puerto Rico, looking at the work being done by national labs, by Department of Energy in the context of recovery, in the context of existing planning studies and other work as well, but also looking at some important benchmarks from other jurisdictions and other regions that can provide important lessons learned that could be applied in the context of the island and the objectives of this process. Second objective of the stakeholder engagement was to provide an opportunity for stakeholder input. And this meant that this process was set up in a way that was fairly unique for the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of sort of the structure of the process, both to solicit feedback on the initiative objectives, so sort of laying out where this is headed and getting input both on sort of the current context of the system, but also sort of that long-term vision, but also to build shared expectations about the long-term pathway, ultimately that will lead to some utility filings, but with many steps along the way, and sort of giving folks a sense of sort of what that direction is, and sort of building those expectations through effective engagement along the way. So that's sort of a snapshot of sort of the objectives there. In terms of the structure, so going to the next slide, this is just a brief timeline building on passage of Act 17, which was Puerto Rico's comprehensive energy policy law from 2018. There were a handful of regulatory actions that instituted sort of the opening of this proceeding, as the commissioner mentioned, and some educational workshops in August and September, which laid the groundwork for the formation of the working groups. Now, there were, as mentioned before, 3 working groups that met 3 times each, starting in November through this past February. And part of this was kind of a modified Chatham House rules, where in order to encourage candid and open feedback, the thought was that participants would be encouraged to speak on behalf of themselves, not on behalf of the organization which they represent, to allow for some really open dialogue and for folks to be able to offer their thoughts and opinions and really open up the conversation in an open way. As part of that, also, opening pathways for remote participation, online streaming of these meetings, and also leveraging digital engagement tools in order for participants to be able to ask questions, to share materials in between sessions as well. This was fundamentally designed as a cross-sector participation model, engaging certainly the utility, PREPA, and non-governmental organizations, trade associations, industry, local communities, to participate, to engage, to present their studies and findings, and to contribute to the products that would eventually come out of the process. And so that gives you a sense of sort of what we were aiming for and how the process was structured. Now getting a little bit more into the substance, so I can talk a little bit about kind of the sequencing of topics and how that connects with some of the other proceedings. I'm going to talk primarily about planning coordination. As the commissioner mentioned, this is one of the 3 working groups. The other 2 being electric resilience and hosting capacity. Planning coordination, looking at that alignment, as the commissioner mentioned, between the distribution planning on the left and the integrated resource planning on the right. And really looking at ways in which, sort of looking beyond the current planning cycle for the IRP, which is scheduled to wrap up early June, as was mentioned earlier, looking at sort of future planning cycles and ways in which new capabilities could be leveraged in order to have enhanced alignment between the planning processes. And so as part of that, kind of focusing into a couple of key alignment points, and I'll just sort of mention, I am part of supporting the NARUC-NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electric Planning, and looking at this coordination, these alignment points, is certainly part of what we're addressing in that process as well. And so, these efforts certainly dovetailed nicely as we were working through this. But if we take another step to the next slide, kind of highlighting 3 of those key alignment points, and they're not coming through very well, but if you can just kind of in your mind focus on that, the 2 top boxes and the arrow that connects them, there's ways in which sort of the 2 forecasting steps between integrated resource planning, which might happen at a sort of a higher level forecast, maybe for the island as a whole, versus the distribution system planning, which might just look at sort of load forecasting for a given substation or you know, and the like. There might be ways in which sort of those forecasting steps might be better aligned, and you can look at sort of opportunities for information sharing across those. Similarly, now it gets a little trickier between the annual long-term distribution planning process and the need for new resources on the right for the IRP. There could be ways in which, for example, you know, looking at resource adequacy needs on the right could be informed by the contribution to planning reserves coming from DER on the left, and similarly, you know, to the extent that DER are procured in the context of IRP, maybe in all sources solicitation, maybe that has impacts on the distribution plan in the context of DER integration needs. And then third, you know, looking at the value of DER, the locational net benefits analysis, and sort of how that ties to defining suitable resource mixes. You can look at sort of, you know, what's the sort of holistic value of DER, and how does that sort of inform the view of looking at possible resource mixes in sort of a capacity expansion context in the integrated resource plan. And then similarly, sort of, you know, looking at that IRP, if you want to sort of think about it in the context of kind of meeting system needs, how does that then inform you know, beneficial locations for DER on the left. So that's kind of 3 examples. And I had a version of this slide that had those 3 kind of highlighted. We lost the highlights, so you have to kind of imagine them in your head. But you know, that gives you a sense of sort of the interplay between, again, distribution system planning left and integrated resource planning right. Now, that's the long-term vision, right? So that's where you want to get to in sort of a long-term future. The question first becomes sort of, how do you start? Where do you begin? And you know, that's where we wanted to start to think about sort of some of the phase 1 near-term topics in the context of planning coordination. So first, kind of fact-finding current state, and we followed this model across all of the working groups, really sort of understand the current system status, understand the current sort of planning practices, really think about sort of, you know, maybe the near-term opportunities are really around just data exchange. Maybe the near-term opportunities are really just looking at ways in which, you know, some of the models can benefit from information that comes out of the planning process, the other planning process. So before you think about ways to truly integrate the 2 processes. So that's kind of in the near term. And then clicking once more on the phase 2 on the right, then you can start to look at kind of the longer term opportunities, whether that's sort of a roadmap for forecasting, looking at true coordination with IRP, or looking at those beneficial locations where you're going to start to drive DER deployment to areas where they provide greatest value in the context of not just distribution, but maybe also the bulk system as well, and how that informs DER sourcing. So that gives you a sense of sort of kind of a near term versus long term. And we split up the topics across all 3 working groups in the same way. So we had sort of a near term vision of how we think about some of the topics, and then maybe a phase 2 or longer term aspect of kind of building on some of those near term opportunities. And across all 3 of those, we then sort of recognize that it's important to draw linkages with other regulatory activity and other proceedings. The Puerto Rico Energy Bureau has a number of different initiatives. This is only a subset of them on the right, around energy efficiency demand response, integrated resource planning, renewable energy credits, performance incentive mechanisms, interconnection, wheeling, and microgrids, but really thinking about, if hosting capacity informs interconnection, how do you draw those linkages? And not just in a way to sort of connect the dots from a sort of substantive kind of regulatory development point of view, but also from a stakeholder engagement point of view, to engage stakeholders and to keep stakeholders engaged. Frankly, there's nothing more dispiriting than when you show up to a meeting to provide input and you're told, no, your input doesn't belong at this meeting, it belongs at this other meeting, at this other week, and this other time. If we can map these so that stakeholders can see where their inputs are being incorporated and how that input is being leveraged and where it applies, that kind of visibility helps both kind of the stakeholder process and sort of the regulatory process more directly as well. And with that, I think that gives you sort of a snapshot of kind of the objectives, the structure, how we phase gated some of these topics and drew some of the connection points. That's really all I had. I do want to thank Joe Palladino and the Department of Energy who supported this work, the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau, Commissioners Ramos and Mateo Rivera and Aviles, our moderator for all of these meetings, Jorge Camacho, and of course my ICF colleagues that worked with me to support this effort across the working groups. So again, appreciate the opportunity and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sukar. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jennifer DeCesaro. Jennifer is the Director of Recovery and Resilience at the U.S. Department of Energy, and Jennifer has a very interesting career in the renewable and in energy space. She has a degree from Colorado College in biology and a master's in environmental law from Vermont Law School. She spent over a decade at the Department of Energy, but took a break, which to be a senior program officer, in technical analysis and advisory services at the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi. So we're really pleased to have Jennifer with us today, and as you can tell, you have a very appreciative audience for the good work that the Department of Energy has done, and we look forward to hearing how this work fits into other programs that you have and what you see as the next steps.
Thanks,
Jennifer.
Carl. Thank you. So I think that Commissioner Ramos and Samir have given a really good background on the process to date. Just to take it up a higher level, I think both Commissioner Ramos and Samir mentioned the work that DOE has been doing through a joint NARUC-NASIO task force, out of which this effort resulted. And I think it's just a really wonderful example of how, our work with organizations such as NARUC and NASIO on really critical issues that are facing our nation's electricity system, especially as we're seeing more distributed energy resources and more sophisticated control technologies coming in on our distribution system, that our work being able to engage through NARUC, through NASIO, with the nation's utility commissions and energy offices, just lay the foundation for us to be able to then move and do some of this more direct work in certain jurisdictions that are really ripe for support. I think one of the things that Carl mentioned in his introductory remarks and that you know, it's really important for the context of some of this work is that Puerto Rico is not in a situation like most of, you know, the other states potentially that, you know, we work with, as Puerto Rico was significantly impacted by Hurricane Maria in 2018. And, you know, since then is really looking to rebuild the transmission and distribution system. And there are a lot of resources coming into play to support that. And so while the process itself is incredibly important, there are other factors that are playing in this space that really are important to take into consideration as this has moved forward. And so, you know, Samir walked through the stakeholder process that, you know, DOE supported. It was imperative that we included all of the federal agencies that are part of this process as part of those discussions, just so that we could take into consideration those unique attributes of what's going on with respect to the long-term recovery. So what comes next? As was discussed earlier, there was a months-long stakeholder process where these 3 working groups met and discussed some really important issues to inform this work moving forward. DOE is working with ICF and others, including some of our national laboratories that contributed to the stakeholder process, to take all of that input. And we are developing a white paper which will include our recommendations to PREB on how our recommendations on moving forward with developing a comprehensive distribution, integrated distribution system planning process moving forward. So there's a lot that's still in underway in this process. And then following our submission of that paper to PREB, there will be additional steps that PREB will take, which I'm sure Commissioner Ramos can speak to as well if there is additional interest. So I think that I will kind of leave it at that for now, Carl, and see if there are questions.
Looking at the questions box, let's see. We do have a question for you, Jennifer. When will the white paper be issued?
Okay, that's a great question. We are, I don't know that I can give an exact date to that. We are kind of in the final stages of drafting, and that is, again, a paper that will be submitted to the commissioners. So I would say in the very near future, but I don't want to go on record and giving an exact date, as we're working through the final drafting of that right now.
Great. Charles, if you could just go to the questions slide, just so everyone's aware. If you have any questions, you can submit them in the questions box. We only had that one come through right now. So if there are any more, that'd be great if you could submit them through the questions box.
Let me ask a question. One of the issues that came up during the meetings was the financial difficulty of PREB, is there is the white paper, and this is a general question, is the commission or the Bureau evaluating the requirements of taking the next steps associated with implementing distributed energy planning, distribution system planning? In particular, what capabilities, what kind of capability building is needed in Puerto Rico to do that and to regulate that?
Carl, may I just clarify, did you mean the financial challenges with PREPA? Or
Yes, yeah. I mean, so one of the observations that I had was that PREPA had more desire to pursue hosting capacity capability and things of that sort, and to develop hosting capacity maps. And I was just curious, that there seems to be an overall need for additional personnel, different modeling capabilities and things of that sort. And Jennifer, I was wondering if the paper is going to look at some of those needs to help facilitate the transition to a more efficient, resilient, robust distribution system.
I mean, I can talk a little bit. It looked also like potentially Commissioner Ramos wanted to jump in here as well. So, I mean, when we're developing the paper, we are looking at, all of the, all of the contributing, factors to the current situation in Puerto Rico. So, I mean, I mentioned obviously the recovery from the hurricanes earlier. PREPA is in financial difficulty. I mean, we're all aware of that. There is talk of a concessionaire coming on, et cetera. So these are all elements that are factoring into our thought process as we're developing this white paper and putting the recommendations together.
Yeah, this is.
Go ahead.
Fiscal situation, and specifically their workforce dedicated to possibly, like you said, doing hosting capacity studies and analyses like that was something that came up time and time and again during the workshops. And we are all very aware of that. And that during the stages of the the regulation development, I think we're all thinking that soon enough, PREPA's problems, and when I say this, I mean a potential, concession or coming out of bankruptcy, that things would align for the better, and PREPA would actually be in a position to be able to, contract the people that it needs, and be in a position to do these hosting capacity analysis and studies. So we're all yearning for that moment, and we're all working, positioning PREPA for that to be a reality.
Carl, we do have some questions coming in, so I do want to jump in. So this is for Dr. Sukar. Your slides mentioned current distribution analysis and fact finding on current installed distribution. Have you analyzed the 172 megawatt of distributed solar plus storage currently in place on the island? And then more specifically, the possibility that PREPA could pay the owners of these resources for services to the grid.
Yeah, good question. So to be clear, we didn't perform any analysis as any new analysis as part of this stakeholder process. What we did try to do as much as possible was see what was out there and make best use of existing data and existing studies. So we did look at where there is existing information and where there are gaps in information. There are a number of installations which the utility has no knowledge of the location or size, and that could introduce some load masking and other issues. Could also preclude the ability for effective arrangements along the lines of what the question is referring, but also taking into account sort of where is there existing data on load forecast? How is the utility undertaking current load forecast, and how can that be improved? So this effort was really from taking the position of taking stock of existing efforts, existing studies, both past, current, and some studies that have not yet been released, but we got some early indications of some aspects of what those studies will say, and made sure to take stock of those in the context of developing the white paper which Jennifer referenced. So again, we didn't do any specific new analysis, but did do our best to take stock of what's been done and to highlight some of the what we view as some of the gaps, or what stakeholders identified as some of the gaps in some of the existing data sets. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you. We do have another question. This is for Commissioner Ramos. How is the storm hardening going? Will there be an increase in underground power lines?
Well, this is something that is part of the current IRP in terms of the hardening and undergrounding of lines. And also it's under the consideration of, or it's submitted to FEMA to be approved. So right now, I can't really answer that question categorically. There will be hardening and there will be undergrounding. To what extent and where is the thing that we have to it's still yet to be determined.
Great. Those are all the questions I have. Carl, did you have anything to follow up?
I'm sorry. I know that that Jennifer has been working very closely with FEMA, and it might be helpful for folks to have some sense of, and I think very successfully with FEMA. I've been very impressed by both the relationship and the dedication of everybody. In terms of the total what's your sense of where FEMA is now versus, you know, their goal of how much more work they're going to, and obviously their specifics aren't necessary, that they're going to pursue with respect to the rebuilding and in efforts to increase resilience in Puerto Rico?
Thanks for that, Carl. So one thing I would like to bring up, and Commissioner Ramos and Commissioner Mateo are participating, but in order to support this long-term rebuild and recovery of the energy sector in Puerto Rico, which I think we all understand is going to take, a number of years to achieve, DOE and FEMA have stood up, we're calling it an energy technical coordination team. So it brings together all of our federal partners as well as all of our partners in Puerto Rico that have a role in energy projects that are part of this recovery. I think step one for a lot of the work that you're talking to, Carl, and that Commissioner Ramos just spoke to, we're still at the beginning phases, and so FEMA and PREPA and Core 3 are working together to really identify kind of what those that permanent repair work is going to look like. And so that includes some of the undergrounding that's being talked about, and other, hardening along with, other repair work. And so, I think, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Carl, but, this is a long process. And for those that might be on the line who are in jurisdictions who have also been, involved in longer term recovery projects such as this, there's a lot that needs to be done up front in that coordination between FEMA and the relevant local jurisdictions to make sure things get set down on the correct path. But what I do feel really excited about is the level of collaboration, which Carl, you did reference, that is happening between the federal partners and the Puerto Rico partners, in making sure that this moves forward, in the best interests of Puerto Rico.
No, I think that's very helpful, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and hope that you all join us for additional webinars this month. And you can find more information on the CPI webinars at www.naruc.org/CPI. And again, thanks to the panel. I think it was a very informative session.
Great. If we could just go to the next slide so they can see all of our. Yep, there we go. Yeah, there is our other webinars. We have one in May, one in June. We do it monthly. So we'd love to have you back. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to do this again in May.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.